The Curtiss P-40 saw action on every front throughout World War II. It remained in service from the United States' entry into the war in 1941 until the end in 1945. But the P-40s will always be best remembered as the aircraft flown by Claire Lee Chennault's American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. For centuries, China had remained isolated from world events. In 1937, Japanese bombers relentlessly pounded the defenseless nation. Millions of Chinese perished in the attacks. Chiang Kai-shek desperately tried to assemble an air unit to defend his country from the invading Japanese. The Chinese leader knew he needed not only planes and pilots, but tactical expertise as well. He therefore turned to a brash aviator whose attitude and ideas had clashed with many in the United States military. In 1937, he appointed Claire Lee Chennault as his air advisor. Chennault had long believed that pilots flying from air bases in China could launch devastating surprise attacks against the Japanese. But for this, Chennault needed money, planes, and pilots. Money from China diverted an order placed by the British Royal Air Force for 100 Curtiss-Wright P-40B Tomahawks. But buying aircraft was only one important step. Well before the war reached America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the U.S. would eventually be drawn into the conflict. On April 15, 1941, Roosevelt quietly signed an executive order permitting Chennault to recruit directly from the ranks of American military reserve pilots. Within a few months, Chennault had set up office and recruited 350 volunteers from pursuit, bomber, and patrol squadrons. These pilots were officially part of the Chinese Army, fighting for a salary of $500 a month and a bonus for each plane they brought down.
They were lured for various reasons. I think some of them were probably looking for adventure or were looking to get into the fight, not unlike some of the Americans who volunteered to fly with the RAF in 1940 and 1941. Some were perhaps lured by the money. There was a significant reward for shooting down a Japanese aircraft, but the AVG took quite a bit of time to get off the ground. They had to get over there. There were problems with the organization. When the P-40s came over, they were not, some of them weren't equipped with sights. They had problems getting them armed. But it can kind of be thought of as something of a ragtag outfit.
Chennault was disappointed by what he saw when his crack pilots arrived in China in 1940. And the pilots were dismayed by the primitive conditions in which they were to live and train. Chennault knew that many of these men had chosen to fight in China to avoid the standard military regimen. Therefore, there would be few rules in the American volunteer group, known as AVG. Salutes were not required. Uniforms were chosen based on comfort and convenience. Discipline was left up to the men themselves. When it came to flying, though, these brash young men were second to none. Among Chennault's pilots were World War II legends such as Tex Hill and Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, who later became the top ace of the war as the leader of the Black Sheep Squadron in the Pacific. The men of the AVG wanted the look of their planes to reflect their aggressive personalities. Vicious fangs and teeth were painted on the noses of the AVG P-40s, giving the unit's fighters their signature ferocious appearance. The P-40 was referred to as the Old Crate by many in the U.S. military, but Chennault knew how to get the most out of his planes and his pilots, even though only 1 in 5 of these men had ever flown the P-40 before. Chennault taught the basics in what he called his kindergarten. Pilots were drilled in the fighter tactics he had developed over decades of flying and years of observing the Japanese. He trained his AVG pilots to use the plane's strengths and to exploit the enemy's weaknesses.
Chennault was very smart, and he knew that the P-40 did not have a chance to outmaneuver either the Mitsubishi Zero, the A6M, or the Oscar, the Army fighter. And so he trained them that they should use the P-40 as a dive and zoom type airplane, in which they would make a diving attack through a Japanese formation, fire, dive away, climb to altitude, and do it again, and never to attempt to maneuver with the Japanese airplanes.
The primary goal of the AVG and their P-40s was the defense of both ends of the Burma Road, the only route from which China could receive supplies over land. In December of 1941, after months of training, planning, and battling the hot summer sun, the AVG and their P-40s were ready for action. The Japanese did not make them wait for long. On December 20th, the word came that Japanese bombers were approaching Kunming. For 2 years, they'd been bombing the city with no resistance. But that day was different. 24 P-40s headed into the skies for battle. The AVG destroyed 3 Japanese bombers in 1 day. For the next 2 months, the AVG met the Japanese in the air at every opportunity. The Japanese still maintained a firm grip on the skies over China, but the AVG had sent a powerful warning during their first 2 months of spirited combat. The cities of Rangoon and Kunming were no longer unprotected. The Chinese newspapers were the first to herald the AVG's victories and dubbed the men the Flying Tigers. After a series of disappointments and defeats at Pearl Harbor, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong, Allied photographers, journalists, and film crews were able to report the victories over the Japanese, raising the hopes of their countrymen.
In early 1942, when they finally started engaging in combat against the Japanese in China, the U.S. was just reeling from defeat after defeat after defeat, and the Flying Tigers were flush with success. And again, it's because of the tactics of Chennault.
Again and again, the Japanese arrived over China, only to be met by the Flying Tigers, which continued to practice Chennault's air-to-air tactics. Engage the enemy in pairs. Use the P-40's superior dive speed to hit and run. Avoid the urge to enter uncontrolled dogfights. And never try to turn with the Japanese aircraft. This constant fighting made for weary pilots and bullet-ridden aircraft. The Tigers could often send up no more than 10 P-40s to challenge the dozens of invading Japanese planes. The AVG was forced to give some ground to the Japanese, but the Tigers had not been defeated in the air. Supplies from the Allied powers continued to make their way up the Burma Road to China. Both the General and Madam Chiang Kai-shek were heartened by the fighting spirit of the AVG. Madam took to calling the pilots her boys, and with true appreciation, declared to the men that the whole of the Chinese nation has taken you to its heart.